Hey everybody, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of my show, William Wallace for America. Today, I'm with the chairman of the Cpra, Chip Kline, and I think it's going to have some interesting information, not just about what the Cpra does, but how it helps our state, how it helps our communities, and also how it helps our economy. We got a whole bunch of questions, so please stay tuned here. Chip, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Well, you know, I'm glad that I have to have some backstory on you, on how you got here, and you know, without giving a lot of those credentials, I'll just let everybody know, you know, you got a lot of good stuff in your background, a lot of good history here, but most of all, a love of Louisiana.
That's right. So I had the opportunity to work. I graduated from LSU and had the opportunity upon graduation to work on Capitol Hill for about 4 or 5 years. I actually worked for a U.S. Senator from Texas and began working with Garrett Graves, who is now Congressman Garrett Graves. And I was actually in Washington, D.C. when Hurricane Katrina hit. And I grew up in South Louisiana, grew up hunting and fishing, spending a lot of time on the coast. And,
where are you from originally?
I actually grew up in Clinton, Louisiana.
Okay.
Did a lot of hunting and fishing in South Louisiana, you know, on the coast, the coastal regions of our state. But living in Washington, D.C., and watching the devastation that was happening in my home state, a state that I grew up in, a state that I have a great deal of pride in and love for, it was tough. And I was looking at the devastation that was playing out all over international news. There were failures at the local, state, and federal levels when it came to Hurricane Katrina, and it was at that point in time that I knew that was the issue that I wanted to work on. And what we say here in the Cpra is that, look, there are countless priorities for the state of Louisiana to focus on.
See, is it the CP for?
Yeah,
countless priorities.
Countless priorities, that's it. But in all honesty, you know, people that live in this state don't really understand the importance of coastal Louisiana, not only to the state as of the whole, to the entire Gulf Coast, but to large portions of the country. And so when you see the devastation and the vulnerabilities that we face for hurricanes, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when the next hurricane is going to hit. And for us to work on positioning our state to be as protected as we possibly can from hurricanes, but then also addressing the various issues that are driving land loss in the state of Louisiana. The fact that we've lost 2,000 square miles of land, which is equivalent to the size of the state of Delaware since the 1930s. Is something that should keep every person who lives and works in Louisiana up at night.
It's interesting because when you look at the shape of Louisiana, you know, and you look back 50, 60 years ago, you know, it looked more like a boot, and now you see that erosion that's kind of following that curve of the Gulf of Mexico coming in. And of course, there's going to be some natural with hurricanes, like you said, but, you know, there's going to be some other stuff that I think that you guys have on your radar that I think will come out as we're talking, you know, about this. So actually, Cpra, what exactly does it stand for? You know, and who are they? What all do you guys do?
So Cpra is the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, and we are the single state entity here in the state of Louisiana that is responsible for coastal restoration, restoring our coast from the various factors of land loss. I just mentioned that we've got 2,000 square miles of land, so we're fighting against 80 years of land loss to restore our coast, but then also address the vulnerabilities and the susceptibility of our coastal communities have for as it relates to hurricanes. And so it's prior to Hurricane Katrina, this issue, the various issues that are now under the single state entity under the roof of the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority were actually dispersed among various state agencies. Prior to Hurricane Katrina, the coastal restoration arm of this agency was in the Department of Natural Resources. The hurricane protection arm of this agency was, prior to Hurricane Katrina, was in DOTD, the Department of Transportation and Development. And so what happened was, after Hurricane Katrina, when we looked at the failures of multiple levels of government,
not because they're doing bad things, just because it's inefficient.
That's correct. It wasn't efficiency, it wasn't streamlined, it wasn't housed under one agency, one single entity that was looking at coastal restoration and hurricane protection. Because it's important to know, William, and for everybody listening, is that coastal restoration and hurricane protection in this state are one and the same.
Right.
When you're restoring the natural buffer, when you're restoring the land, that aids in knocking down storm surge. So for every 2 miles of wetlands that exist, you can knock down storm surge by 1 foot. And so when you're restoring the natural buffer, when you're restoring land, all of that works in conjunction with some of these large-scale hurricane protection systems, levees, floodgates, surge barriers, and things of that nature that were built after Hurricane Katrina. So the large-scale hurricane risk reduction system that was built around the greater New Orleans area that protects that 5-parish area. But what happened was after Katrina, Congress said, look, Louisiana, you need to get your act together.
Right.
You need to streamline the efforts here. You need to come up with an official entity that is focused on this. And as a result, the state legislature acted in 2006. They passed a series of reforms in the legislative session that created the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. So with a single state entity that's responsible for hurricane protection, coastal restoration, our single mandate is to develop and implement a coastal master plan that identifies all of the various hurricane protection projects to protect our communities, but then also identify all of the projects that aim to restore our coast from the various factors of land loss.
You're the organization that brings it all together in one place instead of it being spread out with a bunch of other agencies that all have to get together when they have time around their other duties.
That's right.
This is your primary duty.
Well, I think, look, there is a variety of agencies that are in state government that touch this issue, that that are involved in this issue. When you think about wildlife and fisheries, well, how are they issuing oyster leases, or where, what are some of the things that they're focusing on from a policy front or a regulatory standpoint? Obviously, we don't want to be implementing restoration projects in the middle of oyster leases if we don't have to.
Right.
So there's a lot of coordination there. There's a lot of coordination with the Department of Transportation and Development on where they're building roads and bridges. Are they taking into account all of the information in the coastal master plan as it relates to sea level rise and subsidence?
Because sometimes when you build a road, it's almost like you're making a levee.
That's exactly right. So there's so much coordination and collaboration that takes place in state government when it comes to this issue. And so what we call ourselves really is this hub of collaboration here, the single state entity, but also bringing all the various responsibilities and missions of the various agencies under one roof to make sure that we're all in sync together.
I like that. I like the overall plan, and having somebody to read the plan and be on top of it. Yep. Like you said, what you guys are doing. So you said it's been around since after Hurricane Katrina, basically, and how it started. I like that you got jumped on some of these questions already. How is it funded, though? What funds the CPRA? I guess the assumption is tax dollars, but I think you got some more information on that.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, when it comes to the master plan, the first master plan was developed in 2007. If you would have put a price tag on the first master plan, you'd be looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of about $200 billion. That's $200 billion with a B. So the master plan is updated every 5 years to take into account the best available science. So, science progresses, there's always new information, there's always new modeling techniques and things like that to inform, the projects that we need to implement. The second master plan was developed in 2012. And in 2012, under Governor Jindal, the state kind of took a step back and said, what are the projects? We know the concepts, we know the things but how much money do we think we can realistically obtain, and what is our planning horizon? And that's the first time that the state came up with a 50-year, $50 billion plan.
What I like about this, not to interrupt you, because I want to give you a good train of thought, but I like to point out times like this when I want to point out the amount of planning that went into this. Like you guys didn't just say, oh, we need X dollars, give it to us and we'll do with it what we want. You actually came with a plan on what you created a budget and created what you thought the need was, and then went and asked for that amount of money and not just an unlimited budget.
That's right. I mean, I think we needed to be transparent with the public and with policymakers in the legislature about what do we realistically think we can achieve. We don't want to give people a false sense of hope. It's important for the public to know that we're never going to have the coast that we had in the 1930s or 1940s. We can have a coast, however, that protects the overwhelming majority of our citizens and restores, close to or a little over 800 square miles of land. And so restoring huge portions of our coast, protecting the overwhelming majority of our people is really what this is all about. And so you've got a $50 billion, 50-year plan. It's updated every 5 years. We updated again in 2017 under Governor Edwards. We're currently working on the update which will be done in 2023. I said 5 years. There was a law that was passed
Right.
last year at the legislature that changed it to 6 years. And so we're underneath that timeline right now. But look, the state really began focusing, as maybe as unorganized as it was, probably in the late 90s. So there was a tremendous amount of planning and studying that went into the development of the concepts that we needed to implement.
Right.
But I think it was in 2012 when the state took a step back, really looked at how much money do we realistically think we can get, what are the projects that are the most sustainable, that deliver the most land,
Most bang for your buck.
most bang for the buck, and then protect the overwhelming majority of the citizens. And I think that's a model that has served us well. But I know a lot of people don't like the word study. You know, they want to see dirt turning.
Yeah, they
wanna see
say they
construction,
study, or they're
but-
spending money on, yeah.
And I think we're at a point in time in the coastal program where you're starting to see, as a result of all those studies and all of those analyses that were done over the many decades prior, pay off. And so we've got the institutional knowledge. We know what concepts need to be implemented. We know what funding needs to be, how much money needs to be obtained over a planning horizon. And so we're at a point in time to address your specific question is how are we funded? So the majority of our funding comes from oil and gas production on state lands and state water bottoms and in federal waters offshore. So the only money we get from the state of Louisiana on an annual basis is oil and gas production on state land, state water bottoms. The only recurring source of revenue we get from the federal government comes from the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act. So oil and gas production in certain areas in our outer continental shelf that they return a certain portion of those revenues back to the coastal program. So that generates about $120 to $140 million annually in recurring federal revenues. But then also, William, the majority of our funding over the next 15 years is going to be coming from the settlement from the BP oil spill.
Wow.
A horrific disaster, a terrible natural disaster, probably the worst natural disaster in the history of the country if you look at the overall environmental damage associated with it. But it was also a disaster that resulted in a great opportunity. And as a result of that disaster, you have close to $8 billion that is coming to the state of Louisiana over the next 15 years that must be spent on coastal restoration and hurricane protection. So the state legislature can't go build convention centers and movie theaters and things like that. It's got to be spent on addressing specific injuries associated with the oil spill and then restoring our coast as a result of the damage that occurred.
What I like about this information and what I like to point out, you know, is that at a time when a lot of people are calling for, you know, renewable energy, which I think we need to, you know, that's a good direction to go in. But people sometimes have a bad opinion on oil companies. I think this is the opportunity to show that the oil companies are doing a good thing for our state. You know, a lot of people don't realize how much they actually do for renewable energy, but specifically about the Cpra, you know, oil companies are funding every penny that we need to build our coastland back and save our coastland, which is going to protect not only our environment, and so these oil and gas revenues are, you know, protecting, or indirectly we'll say, or actually pretty much indirectly, protecting our environment, building our coastland back, but they're also saving families and homes and jobs, and at the same time creating new jobs for the environment.
Well, look, I mean, we're an oil and gas state. I mean, I think everybody knows that. I mean, it employs, you know, the governor was just in D.C., testified in front of the Senate Environment and Public Works, and there's close to about 250,000 Louisianans that are employed in the oil and gas industry. And so you mentioned renewable energy. Look, I think that's something that the state has got to focus on, but it can't be a flip of a switch. You know, you've got to allow for the economy and the energy sector to transition to that. But look, if it wasn't for the revenue that is generated from oil and gas, you would essentially just be stuck with the BP oil spill dollars that are going to dry up in 2032.
With several agencies figuring out how to spend it without one oversight.
That is correct. And so there's a whole host of initiatives that we're working on in the state legislature as well as at the congressional level to increase the amount of money that's coming from oil and gas production back to the state of Louisiana.
How many jobs does the Cpra directly hire? How many people do y'all have working here at this agency?
So we've got about 188 people total. We're in the Baton Rouge office today. This is our headquarters here in Baton Rouge, but we also have 3 regional offices in New Orleans, Thibodaux, and Lafayette. So in total, we've got about 188 men and women that work to restore and protect coastal Louisiana. If you look at our annual output, our annual budget right now is about somewhere in the neighborhood of about $887 million. And that can create anywhere from about 7,000 to 10,000 jobs annually. Now, some projects that are not under construction, now we're talking about the Midbarritaria.
So this is the indirect effect that the Cpra has on Louisiana. So you have 188 people directly, but what you're explaining now is because of all the projects you got going on and all the things going on in the state, that's what you're explaining how many people more people we employ.
That's right. That's right. But I mean, if you look at some of the projects that are slated to go to construction over the next several years, particularly one of these large-scale sediment diversion projects, the Midbarritaria sediment diversion. The economic forecast on that was done by Dr. Lawrence Scott with LSU, a well-known economist here in the state of Louisiana, and he forecasted on just that project alone, you're talking about 11,000 to 12,000 jobs in the greater New Orleans area.
Wow.
So you're talking about a $2 billion project, and with about a 6 to 7 year construction timeline. And so the economic impact of what we do here, I think, speaks for itself. And you're looking at, engineers, you're looking at architects, you're looking at construction workers, you're looking at dredging, you're looking at heavy equipment operators. It's a full-blown operation here when it comes to the overall economic benefit. And so look, we mentioned the studies that have been done. We're at an implementation point in time when it comes to this. I mean, we're implementing projects that have been envisioned for years.
So the studies were done in the past.
That's right. So I mean, if you look at the projects that were implemented in the late 90s, when we were just kind of piddling around with this effort, you're talking about $40 million annually. Now we're at $887 million this fiscal year alone on projects that will restore and protect coastal Louisiana. And so it's an exciting time to be a part of this effort.
It's all hands on deck, sounds like to me.
All hands on deck. And so, look, we're in the middle of hurricane season.
Right.
We've already had some disturbances in the Gulf that obviously keeps us on our toes. But look, there's been a lot of lessons learned. And so I think the mindset that we're operating here at Cpra is we got to have a sense of urgency. Our state is disappearing before our eyes. We continue to be vulnerable to storms and hurricanes, and that's why I think this issue has got to remain at the forefront.
And I like how you all are on top of that. I had the pleasure of interviewing Port Fuchsia down there, interviewing the people at Port Fuchsia. We've talked about this.
My good buddy Chet Chasson.
Yeah, Chet Chasson. Hey, guy, you're doing good.
I hope you're watching, Chet.
Yeah, I hope you are watching, Chet. Because I tell you what, and to hear what they're doing down there as Port Fuchsia. Now, and some people might think, well, that's not related to Cpra, but if they watch the interview, they realize that part of Port Fuchsia is responsible for 12,000 jobs, but part of what they're doing down there is that they're doing some coastal restoration within their own boundaries, and you all have worked with them.
Yep, sure.
So when I ask the next question, I know that Port Fuchsia is one example maybe, but how do you all work with other groups around the state on coastal? And now people might think that coastal restoration just is on the coast, but I think there's other projects around the state you guys have worked on also that people don't realize.
So several things there. First, let's talk about Port Fuchsia. So Port Fuchsia, in my mind, is the most critical piece of economic infrastructure anywhere in South Louisiana. Port Fuchsia services 90% of the deep water oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico.
Wow.
Think about that.
Yeah.
I mean, so 18 to 20% of the nation's oil and gas in total comes from South Louisiana, and Port Fuchsia alone is servicing 90% of the deep water exploration that
that's
occurs.
a huge number.
So that's really why we do this, right?
Yeah.
And so it's about protecting homes and businesses. It's about coastal habitat for wildlife and fisheries. But if you look at the economic infrastructure that literally feeds and fuels this country,
right?
That's why the country needs to pay attention to this.
Exactly.
And look no further than what Chet Chasson is doing at Port Fuchsia and the servicing capabilities that the port has.
Because he's bringing everything together, not just the industry, but environment and jobs.
That's right. So, I mean, you look at what he's doing on the industry side alone, but if you look at how he's partnering with CPRA. He's expanding the port, number one. He's wanting to dredge new slips. The material that he's getting from those dredging activities, he's using that material beneficially to restore wetlands, making that port more resilient. And so when Chet and his board of commissioners at the port look at the projects that are called for within our plan, they're coming to the table to say, hey, look, we'll put money up, and we'll leverage state dollars, to help get projects moving faster, sooner rather than later. And so that's the mindset that we need to be operating in. We can't do this alone as a single agency, state government. We've got to have local partners in ports and oil and gas and all of those things, and that's how we're going to be truly successful. So other organizations, obviously there's countless environmental organizations and nonprofit organizations who are involved in this, from the National Wildlife Federation, Environmental Defense Fund, Restore Retreat, National Audubon Society, all of those guys. But look, you'd be surprised. I think the public doesn't fully recognize or appreciate the business and industry associations that are involved in this. The South Central Association, the Bayou Industrial Group, all of those entities that are about sustaining economic activity for business and industry. They look at the work we're doing and say, hey, look, if we're not protecting the very land that we're working from and on, what business do we have?
And not only that, what you're saying here, but I want to point out again, I'd like to point out little things when that I think the audience might want to notice particularly, is that you all are not only working with other agencies and environmental groups and other business and industries, you are listening to them, because you're making you want their information, but you've not only value their information, but you're looking at how to use it in a way to bring it all together for the better of Louisiana, for our environment, our coast, and business and industry, and bringing it all together under one umbrella.
Well, they have a role to play in this process. And so we actually have a series of advisory groups that we've stood up. One is known as the Governor's Advisory Commission on Coastal Conservation, Restoration, and Protection. And it's 40 different stakeholder groups, from ports to oil and gas to recreational commercial fisheries to academic institutions to business and industry, all advising us on what they want to see in our plans. And that's how you get the buy-in. That's how you get the political support. You've had unanimous approval of all master plans and all annual plans. So if you know anything about Louisiana politics, I know you do.
A little bit.
It is unheard of to have a $50 billion plan receive unanimous approval in the state legislature. And I think that speaks to the partnerships that exist, the coordination and collaboration that we have across South Louisiana. You also mentioned earlier that when people think about this, they think about the coast. When we're talking about coastal Louisiana, you're talking about literally Simpsport in Point Coupee Parish, south, east, and west. So you're actually talking about areas in Livingston, Ascension, portions of East Baton Rouge Parish. So it's not just the sliver
coast,
of the perimeter of our coast. It's actually a huge portion of South Louisiana is our focus.
Because like I said, if our ports or the rivers, that whole coast is not doing well, boats aren't getting upriver. There's a whole lot of other things we can point to. How do you all work with the municipalities? On this, we talked. I know it may be common sense because you other groups, but is there anything different with working with the municipality? Do they come to you and say, "Hey, this port or that port," or
I think
parishes for those people who are listening outside of Louisiana?
I think first of all, everything that we do here, our backbone of the master plan is based upon science. And so obviously we're going to take any plan that we take out to the public, to municipalities, to parish presidents, to mayors, to parish councils. It's going to be backed on the science. But then we want to also hear, what are your priorities? What do you want to see from a local perspective included in our plans? And so there is a whole lot of conversations that take place with elected officials, from parish presidents to mayors, parish council members, town council members. What do you want to see in our plans to help restore your particular areas. You know, the people who live in Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes know Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes better than we do.
Exactly.
And so we want that local input. We want the local eyes and ears on the ground to make sure that we're meeting their local priorities as long as it's backed by the best available science. And so there's a whole host of meetings that we do across South Louisiana when we're developing our annual plan. So we've got our master plan, which is our large-scale vision. Our annual plan outlines all of our funding priorities for the next fiscal year. We usually start that process in October. And so we're on the phone with Archie Chasson in Lafourche Parish, with Kirk Lapine in Plaquemines Parish, or Guy McGinnis in St. Bernard Parish, Mayor Cantrell in New Orleans, whoever the elected official is. What do you want to see this year? What's your priorities? What can we do to help you protect your specific parish? And so the relationship, the partnership, collaboration, coordination, I think is exactly where it needs to be.
So what are the positives, because you mentioned statistics a minute ago, so what are the positive statistics that you could point to showing any benchmarks on wetlands saved, marsh created, in the time zones that CPR has been created, coastland saved, or how have you slowed down erosion?
So since 2007, number one, we've secured
a lot of statistics.
Yes. So since 2007, the CPRA has secured about $20 billion. And what that has delivered is about 157 million cubic yards of material that has either been dredged or secured that has created close to 50,000 acres of land. We've built or constructed over 300 miles of levees and over 60 miles of barrier islands. So barrier islands, first line of defense.
Yeah.
What we call there's a method to the madness here.
Yeah.
And it's called multiple lines of defense. So in South
It's almost
Louisiana,
like having a battlefield map and a
right.
general saying, if we have a line here and a line there, and you guys are kind of do the same thing with the levees and...
You got to figure it out.
Yeah.
So you obviously we spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars restoring those barrier islands. When a storm is coming on shore, that's the first speed bump that a surge is going to hit, is those barrier islands. So over 60 miles of barrier islands have been constructed or restored. 50,000 acres of land have been created by dredging sediment from the Mississippi or Atchafalaya rivers or areas offshore, and you pump that sediment inland to create new land. 300 miles of levees. If you listen to Governor Edwards' second inaugural address, the projects that we will break ground on in the next 4 years will actually create more land than we expect to lose in South Louisiana. And that's the first time that we can say that since the 1930s.
That in itself is a remarkable project.
It is. So it's...
Drop the mic right there.
Yeah, so it's you've got the political will, you've got the necessary funding, you've got the support from elected officials and multiple stakeholder groups. And so, now's the time to really move the needle when it comes to the overall restoration.
You're on hyperdrive now. I
can't sleep at night. I get so jacked up sometimes.
What new projects do you have coming up, and what's CPRA's marquee project right now that people might hear in the news or really have the radar on it?
So key projects that are coming up, obviously on the protection side, when I'm saying protection, I'm talking about hurricane protection, is obviously going to be Morganza to the Gulf, is a large-scale hurricane protection system in Terrebonne and Lafourche. The state of Louisiana, in partnering with Terrebonne and Lafourche, have spent close to $1 billion on that project alone. Now this is about a $3 billion project.
And this is the one?
It is federally authorized, and the federal government has just for the first time this year appropriated money for it. It was authorized back in '92, and we've just received in 2021 the first money from the federal government.
Where does that start and finish?
So it goes from Morganza, Louisiana, to the Gulf. So I mean, if you look at it, there's a whole alignment that goes around portions of Thibodaux down through Houma, and it just wraps around large portions of Terrebonne and Lafourche. So that's a key project on the protection side of the shop. Obviously, there's going to be some exciting announcements in the coming days for Southwest Louisiana, an area of our state that was heavily battered during last year's unprecedented hurricane season. The Mississippi River reintroduction into Marpaw Swamp is a great project. The Houma Navigational Canal Lock Complex is another one. But I think if you ask on a marquee project, our lifeline to this whole effort is the Mississippi River.
Right.
The Mississippi River literally built the land we stand on today.
Exactly.
Over thousands of years.
Yeah.
Before the Mississippi River was levied, we were growing at about 2 to 3 square miles a year. When the Mississippi River was levied, that's when land loss started in coastal Louisiana and South Louisiana.
Too bad back then they didn't have that vision to realize.
Well, I have said that time and time again. You know, if we had the political will and the funding back then to implement something like the Midbarritaria sediment diversion, which is, I believe, the marquee project on the restoration side of the shop. And the Midbarritaria sediment diversion, it's located on the west bank of Plaquemines Parish. It's about mimicking the natural process that created the state to begin with. And so you're essentially punching a hole in the Mississippi River levee. You're putting a controlled structure there. It's a gated complex. You've got an inlet channel. It's about a $2 billion, a massive infrastructure type project, but also a green infrastructure project that reintroduces that sediment, reintroduces that fresh water into the Barritaria Basin. The beautiful thing about sediment diversion is that, number one, you're going to create tens of thousands of acres of new land by redepositing that sediment, that fresh water. But you're also going to be sustaining the existing land that's in place, and you're going to be sustaining the land that we're building through some of our dredging projects. And so we spent a lot of time and energy and resources in recent years about dredging and pumping sediment.
Right.
But you can't dredge your way out of this problem.
Right.
Because the second you dredge and pump sediment is the second that it begins disappearing.
Right.
And why is that? Because well, it's not enough, but you don't have anything to nourish it or sustain it. And that fresh water in the river, that sediment load in the river is going to sustain those marsh creation projects and the existing land in place. So it's all about mimicking natural processes that created the state to begin with. And so that's a main priority for us. Again, a $2 billion project. All the while, we're going to continue our dredging operations. We're going to continue some of these large-scale hurricane protection projects. But I tell you, without reconnecting the river, I don't think we can be successful in this effort.
So yeah, you say reconnected, meaning that diversion project.
The diversion project.
I'd have to agree with you on that, because I've always said, you used to, I did a tour a long time ago on a plantation where they said back then they only had, this is 20 years ago, and I remember to this day that they didn't have levees. They had little bitty levees, and they welcomed the water overflowing the banks and building their farmland and bringing in fresh nutrition into their farms. Yep. And you're right. Now that we have these levees, but we don't have that.
And it's important for the public to know that we're not talking about an uncontrolled structure. We're not letting the Mississippi River run wild
flood
through
people's
this
homes,
thing, right? So there's going to be a strict operational regime. Obviously, when we're reintroducing that fresh water, you're going to change the salinity regime in that particular basin. So it could push the fisheries a little further out. You could be impacting some oyster farmers who rely on a certain salinity regime. And that's when we go back to our previous comments on how we're coordinating with other state agencies, coordinating with wildlife and fisheries who have oversight of the fisheries, communities and stakeholder groups on what are the things that they want to see us do to help them transition to other areas, to help mitigate their concerns or their negative impacts. That's all something we're committed to doing.
So in this case, the short term, I don't want to say loss, the short term, pause, we'll say, is going to mean long-term viability and long-term growth, and will maybe and for some of these people's future generations that live there, they're going to benefit from a better environment, a better habitat, and they'll benefit in the long run. Is what you're saying to me.
You singing my song. I could have said it better myself. Sediment diversion is about the long-term sustainability of the state of Louisiana.
I get it. Well, Chip, is there any last parting words you want to let everybody know? I think everybody's got some good information here.
I hope so. I wish that the people that live in the state of Louisiana recognize just how important this state is from an economic standpoint, from all of the strategic economic assets that exist in South Louisiana. But when people look at this issue, sometimes, William, I think that they look at it as, well, that's a conservation type issue, right? That's about wildlife and fisheries and
this
coastal
group says, we don't get to that.
It is that. That's a part of our mission. But look, this is about our survivability. This is about our survival. It's about our way of life. With the fact that you literally have our state disappearing before our eyes is a frightening thought. And we've lost 2,000 square miles of land. If we do nothing, you stand to lose an additional 4,000 square miles of land. You literally, some of the modeling predictions that I've seen have the Gulf of Mexico lapping on the levees of the Mississippi River in New Orleans. that's not a sustainable
Right.
scenario. And I think that's why this issue has got to remain at the forefront. It's about our way of life, our cultural heritage, and this unique place that we call home.
Completely off the cuff, is today's shrimp habitats, or tomorrow's deep sea habitats. If we don't do anything today.
Yes. I don't want to be harvesting oysters off the banks of the Mississippi in East Baton Rouge Parish.
Yeah,
for 50 years.
exactly.
So,
well, I got to thank you very much for your time, Chip. I really do appreciate it.
I enjoyed the discussion.
I think everybody else, I hope everybody else shares the video, shares the podcast. As I always tell people, you can, if they're watching on Facebook or watching on YouTube, you can also catch the podcast on any podcast player. One more question I just thought of off the top of my head is that,
Sure.
Is there a way for other people to get involved? If they like what they heard here, they go, wow, the CPRA is really a great place that we can maybe do some work for or help. Is there a way that people can help the CPRA?
So first of all, we're on every social media outlet known to mankind, from Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can search the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority to find us on social media, but also our website is a tremendous source of information there, coastal.la.gov. We have anything from all the projects that we've talked about today, but also if you're a private entity in the private sector that's looking to do work for the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority, there is a tab on our website on how you can get involved, how you can schedule meetings with us, the leadership at CPRA, how you can get involved to know when bids are going to be on the street, or when you have the opportunity to submit applications or bids for particular projects. We need all the help we can get from not just government officials, but all stakeholder groups, and that includes the private sector.
Awesome. Chip, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
I appreciate
Good
it.
seeing you.
Everybody else, you know the drill. Please go visit these social media sites and like them and share them. Thank you very much.